Well, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Maritime Risk Mitigation 4.0 from Compliance to Decarbonisation. My name is Ben Hillary. I'm the Managing Director of Commodities People, and huge thanks to everyone for joining us here today. Really delighted to see how much this webinar has attracted the interest of the global shipping and trading community with over 800 registrants. In the hour ahead, we're going to be examining two core themes, the ongoing challenges of compliance risk and the rapidly evolving and critical challenge of decarbonisation. We'll be concluding with thoughts around developing and maintaining a holistic approach to maritime risk management and how digitalisation can support this. I'm truly delighted to be joined here today by really an expert group of speakers who bring a very well-rounded set of views to the conversation. Ami Daniel, co-founder and CEO of Windward, Martin Ramirez, MD and Corporate Compliance Counsel of Freepoint Commodities, Richard Watts, Director of HR Maritime, and also the President of the Propeller Club Port of Geneva, Paul Sebastian, co-founder of Climate Neutral Commodity, and Julian Clark, senior partner of INTS. Thanks to you all for your contributions. A few points of housekeeping. Throughout the webinar, please be posting your questions in the Q&A box to be answered later in the session. Please upvote questions of interest. Also, do make full use of the chat channel for any comments you wish to share with the panel and the audience, or even just to introduce yourself. I'm now delighted to pass over to Ami. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everybody. If we take a step back before we dive in, it's really been quite the 2 years. I'm not sure 2 years ago, somebody told me if they had a time machine, they would not exactly have predicted we're all going to be working predominantly from home. It's going to be a global pandemic, but also maybe not a lot of people would have predicted the levels of actually profitability in the shipping and trading business. It's been, in many senses, really a record year for a lot of the trading firms, just because of the volatility of the prices of everything going up and down from, I guess, minus $17 a barrel of oil, I guess, to about 75 or 80, probably unprecedented. Also in the shipping industry, I've seen some comparison about the prices of dry bulk and tanker rates right now in 2008. And are we in a super cycle? And obviously in freight rates, I think it's clear. So it's not just been 2 years of record years on trading and shipping, but also a lot has been changing in one of the world's oldest industries. We've had a bunch of new regulations on sanctions compliance and on ESG and on decarbonization. So maybe a good start to understanding where we are today. We're going to make today really, I think really tangible, really interesting. I'd like to ask maybe one of the best experts in regulation and shipping. Julian, can you take a step back for us and talk to us about what changed in regulation and sanction compliance a year ago? Why is that even important? What's the impact of shipping and trading worldwide?
Thanks, Arlie. I think the big change, and you might be surprised by this, is because I'm going to say risk. Now, the reason that you might be surprised by that is you might say, oh, come on, shipping's always been an industry that's dealt with risk and been surrounded with risk. And in many ways, what we all do in the industry is we manage risk. But I've done this job for 34 years. I've never seen this degree of risk before. And the fact that it's coming at us as a shipping, transport, energy sector from areas that we've never had to deal with before. So areas that are unconnected with the straight pure industry, geopolitical tensions, sanctions regulation, financial compliance is hitting us, really big time. And I think the shock that happened to me, I've advised, for example, on sanctions for a majority of my career. But about 3 years ago, I picked up the phone to a client of mine in Italy. I can talk about this because it was very well documented. It was PB Tankers. They found themselves put on the OFAC list. And I thought, okay, all right, let's deal with that. And they said, can you come across? And I got on a plane that evening. And then I didn't leave their office. I mean, literally didn't leave their office, slept in the office, ate in the office for the next 14, 21 days. And that's because it effectively, we suddenly found that the whole company had been unplugged. overnight that they couldn't supply water and necessities to the ships. Their banks wouldn't speak to them. Their insurance cover was pulled. Even I was questioned by my own board to say, can you be giving legal advice to them? So that's the big change I've seen. I've never seen one single area impact our industry so widely and so dramatically.
And I think that's connected also to new regulation from OFAC. Let me put here on the screen. Ben, if you can help me share a screen, that's great. So I'll put that on the screen in a second, but maybe after Marty. So Marty, you run compliance for one of North America's biggest trading groups, shall I say? What's your perspective? Why is compliance even important? Why do you need technology for that? And can you talk about us about sanctions compliance and then ESG compliance? How do they connect, if at all?
Wow, that's a lot. I'll do my best. Compliance is important for so many reasons when it comes to vessels. I think Julian hit the nail on the head. It's really OFAC compliance has become so much more aggressive. It's become a kind of a tool of foreign policy in the United States, and it's become a very active area. At the same time, a lot of the tools that we use to try to ferret out which vessels are actually having a problem with sanctions have become really excellent in the last couple of years. So you have this confluence of more aggressive enforcement of existing regulations. You had in the Trump administration a very aggressive user of those as a foreign policy tool, and to that, I have this amazing tool, Windward, not a plug, that helps me actually see some of that. And now I have a bunch of vessels that are available. Some of them are no good because of the port. Some of them, too old. And now I'm down to 2. And I have one that has a bunch of compliance problems, and I have one that doesn't. It's an easy choice at that point. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's actually more nuanced than that. I'll have 2 vessels with compliance issues, and I have to figure out which one has the least. That's really hard. And sometimes I have 1 vessel, right? It boils down to 1 vessel. I need a vessel with bow thrusters. So I have 1, and it has problems. Can we get around that? A lot of work. So this has become a big focus of my practice.
So maybe I'll share my screen with a couple very just informative slides. So I think this is a timeline of what we're seeing in terms of sanctions compliance developments. From 2019, you had UN sanctions, and you have more expanded trade sanctions from OFAC. Then you had the UK follow suit, and there's a lot more environmental regulations coming up. So we're going to talk a bit about that. And it's all pressures on the same decision. So when Marty says I have 1 vessel or 2 vessels, at the end of the day, it's the same trades. So you need to pour in all of these regulations to the same decision, and just about numbers, because, I'm an AI kind of guy, so I can't deal without numbers. So there's about 70,000 companies operating in the maritime ecosystem with about 94,000 green low risk vessels. So that's easy, the super low risk. And then the super black sanctioned vessels, also easy. The problem is that thing in the middle. And if you would have heard or read what the CEO of Frontline have said on trade winds and the CEO of Euronav have said in trade winds, they're really thinking there's a pool of Julian, how did he say that? Sanctioned vessels trading, right? Is that how he said that?
Yeah, it's just the, I agree with what Martin said. It's the fact that we're now dealing with something which is far more aggressive. I mean, the previous president weaponized sanctions is what we saw. And of course, I had somebody say to me the other day, oh, but the Trump administration has changed. It's now Biden. Well, you know what? Sanctions aren't going to change, and the same guy that ran OFAC under Trump is the same guy that runs OFAC under Biden. So don't think that you're going to get anything suddenly becoming easier.
Yeah, and we did see a lot of sanctions in the last month, right? We saw an Omani broker getting sanctioned, so I think that may put brokers on notice. And you've seen more traders put on notice as well. So. And you've seen, I think there was this firm in Singapore that said on trade winds that they lost all their business due to being put on the list, right, Julian? That happened?
Yeah. And this is again, if I go back to the PB example, okay, PB had 1 vessel that had got a Venezuelan trade with, it was doing a Venezuelan trade. She was entered into a time charter previous to there being any Venezuelan sanctions. And we were trying to get the vessel out of that time charter. We couldn't. There was no sanctions clause in it. So fair enough. All right, you may have 1 ship there that OFAC could genuinely say, let's put that ship on the list. But they sanctioned the entire company. They even sanctioned an FPSO, which wasn't even owned by PB. PB managed it, and they sanctioned that. And now that was supplying energy to North Italy. So they suddenly shut down North Italy, and then all the brokers involved in that get involved, all the ship suppliers get involved. So yeah, it's scary stuff.
So it's a global supply chain, I think. And now maybe Marty said that before, but there's compliance in sanctions and there's compliance in ESG, right? So maybe Richard, could you talk to us a bit about, from your experience at the Propeller Club and the clients you're working with, what do when people say ESG, when people say carbon emissions, what do they mean? How big of a thing is this? Is it, ships have been trading. Is there any other way to trade? So talk to us a bit about that and what's going on in that world.
I mean, it's an incredibly complex subject at the moment. It's very, very difficult to get your head around. And I find very few people are able to fully understand what we mean by ESG, what we mean by sustainable. And I mean, when you kind of boil it down to the basic elements of sustainability, it's, don't do anything that's really quite nasty. But the problem is when you're actually trying to put it into clearly defined criteria, it's very, very, very difficult. Now, just touching on the compliance bit that you were talking about a minute ago, I find it really interesting at the moment because very often companies, they're having trouble getting their head around it, figuring out what is compliant, what is not compliant, what are the sanctions that are involved. And we have a lot of different tools out there that we can use, which give us information on vessels. Big companies, they can manage. They have the scale, they have the size to actually have compliance teams and to understand what's going on. Smaller companies, they tend to rely much more on their banks and their insurance. And so basically they submit deals to the underwriters or to the financing banks and then say, are there any compliance problems? Are there any sanctions? But the problem is that you can't actually legally rely on what they've said. It's your responsibility yourself. Most of the assumption is if there's any risk whatsoever, just avoid it, which tends to, okay, it keeps you safe, but at the same time, then you have to be very, very, very careful about what you're touching at all. Certainly the banks are very, very difficult. I mean, the banks have access to an awful lot of information at the moment, and they have a lot of information, but they don't necessarily understand that information or know how to use it. And I had a situation a couple of years ago, a client of mine, they had chartered a vessel of iron ore from Brazil going over to China, and they got a message from their bank saying, we can't transfer the funds because your vessel is under sanctions. And they said, well, why? Well, because it's been operating in Iran for the last 3 weeks. And we said, well, hang on, our vessel is just loaded in Brazil. We know it is. We're tracking it through AIS. We know that it's just gone round the Cape of Good Hope and it's coming up to China. It's not in Iran. And the problem is the bank said no. Computer says no. Can't do anything. And we ended up in a situation where I actually do some research. Turned out there were 2 vessels with the same name. They'd got the IMO number mixed up. And this was a very, very large company that provides this data to the bank, which just made a simple mistake. But the reflex was, no, we're not doing anything until we have the proof that it's actually okay. So it's a really difficult place at the moment. I mean, otherwise, moving on to the original question of
Wait.
ESG.
You just covered a lot of things. Wait. The discussion. Okay. So I think you bring up 2 things. One is the gap, right? There are the big boys and there are the small boys. And what are the small boys supposed to do? I'm going to paste here in the chat. It's interesting because I wrote an op-ed exactly on that last week, which had 137 shares. So take a look at that because I called it originally, by the way, empathy and compliance, because it's really not empathetic to ask for the small players to have the same tools as the big players, and maybe the big players who choose an AI and not just false positives. Something gives you false positives. But Marty, have you seen any false positives in this industry? Is that a thing? Because what Richard just said costs him money, and that's because of a false positive of a bank. So have you seen anything like that?
We see a lot of false positives, and that's simply because the way that a lot of these tools work is that they're algorithms, and algorithms are based on data. And a lot of times, they have rules set up, and they use the data, and they come up with a call. And a lot of times, what we do is we actually use a secondary source of data, and we'll sort of make sure that that call is accurate. And we have had instances where we'll go actually to the vessel owner or the operator and say, hey, our service is saying that your vessel is in Iran. Do you have something to say about that? Because we can't use you unless you can explain it. And they'll say, oh, our AIS broke. Here's an email showing that, we emailed our vendors saying that our AIS broke. Can you fix it when we go through India? So, typically it's not just good enough to rely on data. You always kind of still have to have a person there reviewing that, because you will end up with false positives, both ones that say you can't use this vessel and what I'm more afraid of is the one that says you can use this vessel, but it actually does have a problem. So sort of understatement or overstatement of risk is a big issue. And I think you really have to have somebody knowledgeable to sort of go through that. And quite to that point, big companies can have those people laying around. It's hard for smaller companies to do that.
Yeah, I think you're hit it right in the head. So maybe Paul, can you take a step back? Climate neutral commodities helps people understand, if I understand correctly, how do they do, what's the regulatory frameworks and how do they do carbon neutral shipments and tradings, right? So can you talk to me from your perspective about ESG compliance and decarbonization, and how should people even start thinking about that?
Yes, thank you. So first, I would like to bounce back on what Richard says. So all those notions are pretty complex to grasp for many players. So responsible, sustainable, green, carbon neutral, climate neutral. That's pretty complex, and the misuse, I think, of those notions may lead to backlashes for industry stakeholders. So greenwashing charges, especially. Just to give you an example, that's pretty fresh news. That was last week. Maybe you have read that in the newspaper, but last Thursday, a major asset manager listed in the US lost 14% in the stock market in one day because a prosecutor opened an investigation on their sustainability metrics that they used. So the point is to misuse those notions and to misuse metrics, as Martin says, or misuse of data may lead to reputational risks. That's a fair thing, but also now to financial risks, and that's a major issue for industry stakeholders. And so to answer your point, we see now growing demand for green supply chain, and of course for green logistic shipping solutions. And so factually speaking, there's a growing demand for green bunker solutions. But to provide carbon neutral bunker solutions, that requires two steps. First, to measure the greenhouse gases of the life cycle of the bunker from the production to the end use, and that's pretty complex because you have to deal with different gases, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, for instance, and with many data and emission factors. So the calculation itself is pretty complex, and then you have to mitigate and reduce the carbon footprint with quality recognized carbon credits that are proving additionality, that are proving measurable carbon sequestration, for instance. And so all this process is pretty complex. And just to finish on another anecdote, last year, sorry, you may also have read that in the paper. A well-known airline company have been accused of greenwashing because they overclaim their carbon neutrality with a controversial carbon projects. And so it means that for companies, for industry stakeholders to lead this process in a non-appropriate way may lead for a stronger backlash. And so there is a need for support, for standardization, for transparency in the way companies are claiming for their carbon neutrality achievement.
Okay, so that's very clear. I see we already have questions, which I'm going to come into for a second, but I'd like to come back to Richard. So Richard, I want to show you something, and let's talk a bit about that. When people talk about carbon emissions in shipping, I think we spoke about that before. These are basically the things that drive CO2. So if you take a vessel and you want to understand what are just the vessel specification, what drives the carbon emissions, you have commercial decisions like speed to drive 56%, and you have the operational decisions like draft and trim and hull fouling and weather, which actually drive the latter parts. So in other words, the vessel specification isn't that important. Or it doesn't call the shots, so let's say. What's been your experience from charterers and for people looking at just in time, and how is that really important both to ship owners and charterers? Can you talk to me a bit about that?
I mean, certainly, I think it's quite interesting to look at a graph like this and to see where the different, which factors are more important. It's interesting, the commercial decision, that I'm assuming is the commercial decisions made by the ship owner and not necessarily made by the charterer. And so I think one of the problems we have at the moment is that we tend to be kind of isolating shipping into its own little world and neglecting the fact that the reason we have shipping is because we have goods that we're moving around and we have charterers who are buying and selling those goods. Part of the issue that I see with a graph like this, or what it really demonstrates to me, is that we talk a lot about the supply chain of the industry that we work in, but actually we have a very, very, very fragmented supply chain, and there are so many different actors involved in this supply chain that every single actor has their own different commercial interests, and so it's very, very, very difficult to harmonize that. And so if you're taking, for example, a cargo which is being loaded in a certain port and then it's being shipped somewhere and discharged, you normally have an exporter, you have a trading company, you have the importer, then you also have the ship owner, you might have an operator in between, and they all have their own different commercial interests, and they're very rarely actually working together to try to harmonize make the voyage more efficient, basically trying to reduce waste during the voyage. And that's, I think, where we really need to be focusing at the moment, saying how can we reduce a lot of this waste that we have at the moment, and how can we make everything just run a lot smoother? We can use data, but it's actually how much do we want to share that data. And a point that Paul made about transparency, it's transparency between the parties. And one thing I love about the world of chartering and shipping is that we all want transparency. We all think transparency is great, as long as we're looking down. So as long as we're looking at our level, we don't want any transparency. We don't want anybody else on our level. So the traders don't want the other traders to know what they're doing, but they want to know exactly what the ship owner is doing. Whereas the ship owner doesn't want the other ship owners to know what they're doing, but they want to know exactly what is happening on their vessel at every moment. And so it's really interesting how we have this problem of transparency and the way that different people look at it.
So that's interesting, because probably I think our approach and what we've seen is that there is a way to get to accurate. So first of all, right now, from my experience, and Marty, I'd like your feedback on that for a second. There's a lot of regulation in carbon accounting, but a lot of the firms are still at the, where am I in my carbon emissions? They're not necessarily where should I be. But one way to do that is using data. But right now, the data that's out there is about, and I've seen everything in the market, it's about 20 to 60% wrong. So if people tell you this ship is an E, it's a B, it's a C, there's a 20 to 60% margin of error, which means it's non-tradable in the carbon market and not actionable. So there is a way to do that. And that's actually, if you use AI, you pull a lot of fuel consumption data, you train on it. Basically, the thing is, nobody has enough data to solve this problem alone. So there is no ship owner, even Maersk or MSC, they're not big enough. You don't have enough population to train a model, which is why we're basically opening a carbon partnership program to invite people in, to bring in data, but get the benefit of everybody else's data. And that's why the only way to tackle the carbon emissions problem, in my humble opinion, is together. So Marty, we've been speaking about carbon emissions. Is this a regulation? So is this a law? Does this come from the banks? Does it come from the US, from the EU? Obviously, OFAC compliance come from the US by definition. But the EU is doing this regulation, but you're American. So why should you listen to them? Talk to me about that.
Sure. It all basically boils down to the banks. I mean, the banks really, if you want to be in the commodity game, you've got to get financing. And the banks decide that. A lot of the banks are European. ESG has been the law of the land in the EU for quite some time now, several years. And this is something that the banks are being asked to look at who they're lending money to, what are the projects that they're financing, and what is the carbon footprint of those projects. In the United States, we don't have any ESG laws, right? We're still kind of waiting for that shoe to drop. And so in a way, it doesn't matter, because if your bank doesn't want to fund your deal because they think it's too carbon intensive, then you don't have a deal. It doesn't matter whether or not there's regulations in the United States. So basically, we're sort of being sucked into a more sort of European, kind of zone where we have to please our banks, and a lot of our banks are European.
So Paul, let's say that a bank says, I'd like to know that's decarbonized, or I'd like to know that's true. How can they even know that? Is there like a notion? Is there a regulatory framework? Is an industry initiative enough? How does that work, right? Because all the banks, there's banks for net zero, there's the Poseidon principles for banks that are here coming up. So there's a lot of treaties. But how can people know that third parties are really reporting the right way? I've heard some Marty talk about that yesterday, but I'd like your feedback on that first.
Right, that's a very good question, and
Yep.
that's a critical issue. Just to give you an example, 2 weeks ago, I've been approached by a major national oil company that has to refinance for several billion of dollars of assets, and they have been asked by their usual financiers to prove now a measurable and robust achievement in terms of sustainability to get the financing that they expected to get as usual. And so they asked us, how can we prove that? And the questions of transparency, also as Richard said, of transparency, of standardization in those metrics is a topical issue. That's why, for instance, in Europe, the European Union is working on the EU taxonomy. So that's a classification standard for all those metrics, but it's part of the journey. But there's also a demand for and a need from the industry itself for regulatory framework or industry-driven standards in order to improve clarity, transparency. Because without clarity, it's also pretty difficult to identify top performers. It's also difficult for first movers or top performers to differentiate themselves from other players. So that's a core need for the industry to define standards that are independent, that are credible, that are publicly available, and that's for instance that's what we in our approach, that's what we build with climate neutral community. That's to bring a readability, transparency in those.
So from my experience, when things evolve, and I've seen this in compliance 2 years ago with OFAC, when it came out originally, people were like, "Oh, compliance, it's all the same. No, there's no difference." And now, Julian, you probably see that as well, right? But now it's getting more nuanced, right, Julian? People understand, well, not all the products are the same, not all regulations are the same, not all sectors are the same. So, Julian, can we talk to me about that? Because then I'd like to transfer the learning from you on this to talk about carbon credits. So you're actually kind of preparing it for the slam from Richard.
Okay, thanks, Army. Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen developing is exactly what you've said. First, there was kind of a head in the sand kind of approach, which was either a combination of, it's not going to be a risk for me, or you know what, we're ready for this. We've got systems that can deal with this. But what we are finding out more and more, and we found this out with big institutions, so with banks, with financial institutions, that the shark net that they think they've prepared to deal with regulatory compliance actually has massive holes in it, and it's not stopping the sharks from coming through, and they're just not aware of that. And I know something that you're very passionate about, Army, is people that turn around now and say, things like, lawyers, hey, we're a law firm, we give legal advice. So what? What companies need is gap analysis.
Sorry, I was sleeping while you were saying something, I think.
What you need is.
I'm not sure what you were saying right now. Like,
I know.
Is that a mosquito?
Hey, I haven't got the clock on either.
Yeah.
It's all about gap analysis. It's about finding out, where are your exposures. And coming on, it's interesting what Richard was saying. I suddenly thought, actually, what Paul as well and Martin, what suddenly dawned on me was, years and years and years ago, when vessels used to have radio operators. Yep. And radio operators, the thing that everybody knew in the seafaring community was, if you met an old guy that was a bit weird and was a bit strange, they probably used to be a radio operator, because the guy did go.
Julian, I'm not going to comment about that and ask what you do for a living.
No, well, there you go. They did go insane. The reason they went insane was they were listening to all this flack and traffic and white noise and trying to filter out what the truth was. And that's the problem that the industry's got now. There's so much flying at it. There's so much that is it true? Is it not true? How do you verify a carbon credit? How do you know if you're compliant? What does ESG actually mean? And like we saw with the Gulf of Aden piracy stuff, suddenly everybody was a piracy expert. Everybody was a ransom expert. Now suddenly everybody's an ESG expert. Everybody's a compliance expert. And the majority of people out there are not. They do not know what they're doing.
So actually in the article I referenced above, you would see I introduced the concept of compliance risk scores like credit risk scores.
Yeah.
Because actually in the US, when you go out to take a loan, Marty, you know that better than I, right? You have a credit score as a person. Is that correct, Marty?
Yeah, absolutely. It's basic. I mean, you got to have it.
But in the world of shipping compliance, you don't. You have one of our, I spoke about this with one of the biggest charters we have as a client yesterday, and he told me, listen, this OFAC thing right now, we the charters, we do the compliance, but the ship owners, they actually don't know what their risk score is. So they might wake up one day and say, whoa, I didn't get hired. And then they go out to the Windward Vessel Feedback Forum, or they call Julian, or just to get pissed and say, who do I know to change my risk score? But actually, could you be proactive and do that? And I'd like to talk a bit about ESG. So Richard, back to you. Could you talk to me about, or maybe Paul could, one of you could, to carbon credits, right? I get that. Carbon is a bad thing. We need to stop with that. But how do we close the gap? Because right now there's a voluntary market. Somebody here wrote $10 a ton. We lost Marty. Somebody here wrote $10 a ton. I know it's about 50. I've seen it read to 50 euros a ton. So Richard says less than $10 a ton. So is this a thing people can make money out of, or is that just in the mandatory emission trading scheme in 2023? Richard, help me, then Paul can help me. Talk to me about carbon credits, in other words, offsetting.
I'll jump in with a couple of comments, but then I'll pass it over to Paul, because I think he's much more of an expert in this area than I am. I think one of the
everything sounds better in French, by the way. That's a very well-known fact.
As always. One of the problems with carbon credits, I think, is understanding of them, and so it's also having confidence in them, and so it's really understanding what does it actually mean, what are you actually buying, and by spending this money, are you actually making the world a better place? Are you actually reducing emissions? And I think a large part of it is actually boiling the question down to, why are we actually doing this? To be incredibly blunt, and why do we care? And this is not to say that we shouldn't care, but I think it's a question of analyzing, why do we care? Because then we can actually take the right steps that we need to move forward. And do we care purely because of profit? Is it a question of the different costs, the different revenue, the different possibilities it gives us? Is it because of reputation? Shipping companies are not very visible as far as the final consumer is concerned, but trading companies are becoming more and more visible to the final consumer. Is the company...
A lot of shipping companies are traded on NASDAQ, actually. If you look at Capital, they're traded, Navios are traded. You have a lot of obviously Zim is traded, Maersk are traded. There's a lot more getting traded because the markets are good.
Well, that's the next point. I mean, are they listed or not? Is the company listed? And that's a very, very good point. And that has a big impact, because also that impacts on the financing options.
Sure.
In terms of the financing options, I mean, ship finance, but also trade finance. And we've already mentioned the impact that emissions have on financing. But I mean, last year there were 2 trade finance deals that went through with Gunvor and also with Dreyfus, where the interest rates were linked to the amount of emissions created. But then it takes you onto the question of saying, how is this measured? Is this actually properly measured? Is this reliable? And that's something that I think is very, very difficult, and it needs to be a very, very clear framework. Now, to get into more of the details, I'm going to pass over to Paul, because he has a lot more knowledge on this subject. So Paul, over to you.
Paul, tell me, so carbon credits, could we, wow, Richard, you're on fire. Well, Richard Stevenson, I'll come back to that, these comments in a second, but Paul, so is carbon credits a real thing? Could somebody make money out of? Is that something you could sell? For instance, if you go to green methanol or blue ammonia, or choose a color and the name of a chemical, or is this something I have to do?
Yeah, I think that first carbon credits, so based on the voluntary carbon markets, because we have to differentiate the compliance markets and the voluntary carbon markets.
For sure.
In the voluntary markets, we have to consider carbon credits as part of the journey to carbon neutrality, and that's something to keep in mind. The objective for the industry in 2050, and part of the regulatory and international objectives, is to reach carbon neutrality. But before indeed that all the maritime industry is factually carbon neutral, it's important to accompany the industry in its journey, first to reduce its carbon footprint, with new technologies. So that's why indeed there is a need also for a framework to incentive to put incentives in on investments, but also to ensure that the unabated residual emissions are properly mitigated and reduced. And so that's why the voluntary carbon market has a role to play in that. But the main issue indeed in the voluntary carbon market is that it's a non-harmonized, non-standardized market. So there are many standards, there are many kind of projects that's from avoidance projects, reduction projects, and sequestration projects, for instance, that the well-known mitigation hierarchy within those projects. So it's a mess, even for people who are 24/7 involved in these industries. It's a mess to understand how it works. So the first issue for the industry, for the carbon market industry, is to standardize and harmonize its way of working, and that's part of the demand of the COP21 article, the Article 6, is to promote the standardization. And we see numerous initiatives like the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market working this way to propose an umbrella organization to standardize this market. But within those markets, it's important for each players that want to either to reduce its own, to mitigate its own carbon footprint through credits, or to trade on credits, because indeed you may buy some credits and trade them. It's important to understand what is how those credits are issued and what are the quality principles, in order to guarantee that the company acquires high quality credits. So there are a few lists. I'm not going to list them right now, but there are the main principle would be to ensure the additionality of those credits. So it means that without those credits, the sequestrations, the mitigation project could not occur. And then that the carbon reduction is measurable, you may prove it. And so that's why there's different standards, different qualities that are recognized in the market.
So Paul here says that carbon credits won't help you as a ship owner, I guess, Paul, meet the coming EXI and CII requirements for ships. So Marty, this is a quick view of the recent frameworks in the carbon markets for shipping. You had the IMO approved initial GHG strategy in 2018, and you had the Poseidon principles. And you would have seen a gentleman from Standard Chartered, I don't remember his name right now, talk about with the FT, write a letter to the FT about the fact they provide better credit terms for people who are showing their decarbonization improvement, shall I say. I think 8% improvement. And then you had the Sea Cargo Charter, which was launched by the Global Maritime Forum, that asked people to assess and do the carbon accounting. President Biden called on the IMO member states to achieve zero emissions by 2050, and you have the EU Emission Trading Scheme, EXI, and CII for upcoming regulations. So Marty, as the guy who runs compliance, how are you dealing with all this flurry of regulations? Basically, every other week you could get, another guy, think about another abbreviation that says something on shipping and trading and decarbonization. So what's your approach?
Well, part of it is, we're not going to have anything global for quite some time. Luckily, I have a team that are all over the world, and we tend to focus on what's local. And there's a lot of good stuff out there, but it takes a lot of really due diligence on each of these standards. Because one of my biggest fears, frankly, is greenwashing. A standard that says that it's doing something and it's really not getting it done. I mean, that's a huge concern, because at some point that will out, and all of the work that you've done, all the resources you've been putting in, all those good intentions are really wasted. And then the other thing we worry a lot about is fraud. I mean, when you look at the EPA system in the United States for RINs, I mean, it's just infested with fraud.
I'm sorry,
and,
whoa. What's EPA in that? I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that.
This had to do with the different biofuels emission, so, in terms of the credits for that, a lot of that was, there was a lot of fraud involved, there still is. There's always a lot of cases involved. And in the US, when you buy one of these instruments and it turns out to be fraudulent, you have to buy another one. So I
So
would
it's
simply
it's on you. So the responsibility is on the buyer to do the due diligence.
Yep, and we have a list, like a white list of companies that we'll buy them from. And my fear is that this becomes kind of another place where I'm going to need to have a whitelist, right? And I'm going to have like 20 different carbon, emission rating companies telling me whether or not what I'm doing is real or not. And again, like I said, then I have the banks telling me, well, you need to sign on to this one because this is the one that we think is good, right?
Yep.
And now I have that pressure. So that's really my greatest concern, is that right now there's just all this kind of like instability, and it would be great to see Paul's system sort of win the day and have a total standard. But I think it's really going to still require people doing their due diligence on the standards and whether or not they do what they say they do.
So Julia, maybe back to you. Are you as a law firm involved in ESG compliance at all? Because obviously you're one of the world's experts in sanctions compliance, and I've seen you've launched Maritime, and congratulations for that. But from a ship owner perspective, when do I call you? Do I call you, or from a banking perspective, do I call you when I have a sanctions problem? Because this ESG compliance is, it's becoming a real thing, right? And I need to be dealing with all kinds of these stuff. So how can you help me, or who can help me deal with this?
It's about loss prevention. I mean, law historically has been very reactive as an industry. You wait for somebody to call when you've got a problem. That's not the solution anymore. What we're facing is too devastating and potentially harmful to a corporate. So it's about getting your advisors, whoever they may be, lined up first. I completely agree with what Marty's been saying. I wonder personally whether, although I can throw this out there as a solution, but it's going to open a whole other debate, is whether blockchain is the way we should be going in relation to verification of carbon credits. And getting kind of the immutable ledger technology together and working on transparency across the sector so we can have a verifiable blockchain of information.
So I'd like to maybe wait. I need Dhruv here is asking carbon offsetting present, and some of the members here would have to help me. Maybe Paul, that's you, or maybe Richard, that's you. It's certainly not me. Dhruv here is asking, carbon offsetting presently is a moving target which changes every few years, with a vessel lifespan of 20 years as an average. How, as a ship owner or investor, you put in a safeguard that your asset will be in compliance for its lifespan? Who can help Dhruv? Oh, yes, Richard, go for it.
You can't advise them. Basically, there's no way to do it at the moment. I don't think there is. It's what are you going to use as fuel? Are you going to put in place LNG? Are you going to methane? The problem is that nobody knows, and anybody who says they do know is not being entirely truthful.
Okay.
Maybe I could add that indeed that there is some estimation that estimate that the decarbonization of all the maritime industry would require a $1.6 trillion investment by 2050. So it's massive, it's huge, and the lack of clarity that we discussed previously may lead to reluctance from ship owners to invest in a new technology, because they are pretty scared to get locked into a wrong technology. And so that's why I think there's a need for, I don't know if that's a regulatory framework or an industry-driven framework, but there's a need for a framework to accompany, to bring clarity to the industry. And just for example, I read a few weeks ago that there's an initiative funded by the International Research and Development Board to launch a $5 billion research and development fund in order to provide these good answers and to provide research and development for new technologies to support the decarbonization of the industry.
So I see carbon credits are very popular here today. We have Laurent. I'm sorry, Laurent, if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. I'm trying. Paul, I hope I am pronouncing his name correctly. He says wind assist devices, rotors, and sails are now available to ship owners as a way to improve efficiency. how can they be eligible to carbon credits? Paul, do you know how to help us with that?
For which, sorry, who can be eligible? What was?
Rotors and sails. If I put a big sail on my ship,
Yes.
so how can that be eligible?
That's not my. I'm not a methodology expert. So the question should be asked to the, let's say, the two main standards in the industry. That's a Vera gold standard, for instance, on how they could make their projects eligible to issue credits. And so there should tick some boxes, some criteria that prove that indeed those innovations are factually reducing the carbon footprint of those vessels, and that those credits are essential, that the issuance and the marketing of those credits are essential to make those innovations viable. So it's part of those principles. But right now, I could not pronounce myself on the behalf of those certifications.
Okay, so I'd like to take a step back for a second and maybe try to just map the areas a bit, because I think people talk a bit about. I'm going to come back, Annette. I'm going to come back to your question in a second. So I think people are talking about decarbonization. Woo! So let's talk some numbers, okay? Shipping is about 3% of the world's emissions, but it's on track to be 10% if we don't do that. And so it's a big problem to handle. It's also a very focused problem, because if anybody of you have read How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates, which I thoroughly recommend you to do, it's a very good starting point to understanding decarbonization at global level. You would see some of the problems are extremely hard to fix. For instance, cement. How do you make cement without carbon? You don't. Or somebody needs to think about that. Or steel. How do you make steel without carbon? Good idea. It's kind of in the steel mills, you kind of need the carbon. It's kind of part of the thing. You can use carbon captures. So, but if you look at it and you didn't take a step back, but then zoom into the shipping industry, you need to think about the different stakeholders. So this is how I would think about it, okay? There's the ship owners. Ship owners are thinking about the CapEx, i.e. innovative fuels, rotor sails, sails, rotors, whatever, and fuel optimization. How can I optimize it? The problem with fuel optimization, performance optimization, a lot of people are asking you to put in an IoT investment. So they're asking you, no problem, just write this small check, please, for 100K per vessel, please, before I tell you what it does, and that's a problem. So you actually could use AI to optimize that and benchmark your vessels based on if you train AI model on some fuel consumption data and then apply it to the world fleet. Then there are the charterers. The charterers have Freeport is a charter. Right, Marty? You charter vessels on a daily basis. Do you know how much?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any numbers? How much? 1, 2, 5, 10?
It's less than it used to be a year ago, but it's still, I mean, just even the ones that get escalated to me is probably a dozen a week.
A dozen a week. So let's
say,
let's say it's like 4 times that, right? So 200 vessels a month, right? Just by way of example. So the charters actually need a decision point. That's the pre-fixture chartering decision, which should say, well, which vessel should I choose? I have this one and this one and this one, and every one of them has a different ballast leg and a different speed and different performance. So how do I do that? That's the charters. Then you have the banks. The banks do trade finance. Actually, ship finance is pretty easy because you just need carbon accounting. So just ask the person for carbon accounting and, and knock the number of the, nail the number of the credit interest to their performance and their improvement performance. But trade finance is much more complicated. Maybe Julian, you could talk to me about that for a second, about what's trade finance, why it's complicated. And then you have all the containerized goods world. And the containerized goods world is kind of a different brother to all these because it's not really dry bulk or wet bulk. And then you could really drive that from the consumer. So I think that mental framework of ship owners, charterers, trade finance, and containerized goods could really help us. So Julian, could you maybe help us, or maybe Richard, one of you could help me understand what's trade finance, how they actually finance goods, and how does that meet both the screening for sanctions and could be the screening for sustainable trade finance?
I'm going to chuck that one straight at Richard. I think Richard's probably got that better than I have.
Sure.
I mean, in terms of trade finance is changing very, very quickly at the moment, and it's not really the subject of today's discussion, but the world of trade finance is having a huge impact on commodity trading itself. And so there's a lot less trade finance available than there used to be. It's a lot more difficult to get trade finance. In order to open a bank account with a trade finance bank takes on average about 6 months to start a relationship. And then depending on the size of the company, you have completely different access to trade finance. Now, the big companies tend to look at this from a point of view of say, well, I've got as much trade finance as I need and I just ask for more and I'll get more. The smaller companies, they don't get anywhere near as much trade finance as they would like. How this is going to have an impact onto the emissions thing, I think that it's, as I said before, it's going to be much more about the trade finance banks are under pressure. They're under pressure from their shareholders because nearly all of them are publicly listed companies, and they're under the pressure from their shareholders to focus on financing green commodities. And we're going to see a number of the trade finance banks just pulling out of the industry completely because of reputational risk. We've seen that in the last year or two with BNP pulling out completely, a number of other banks pulling back because there's quite a lot of risks involved. But I think we're also going to see a lot of the banks focusing on certain trades, and we're also seeing with insurance. Some of the big insurance underwriters, I mean, I think Swiss Re basically said we're not insuring anything that is coal related. And so ends up having a huge impact onto the trade because Swiss Re is actually the reinsurer for a tremendous number of policies. And it's just something, you have so many different interlocking angles that it's very difficult to manage. And certainly from a day-to-day point of view, and the problem is that trade happens so quickly. You know, you're looking at different opportunities. You're looking at, okay, I've got this trade, I've got this potential purchase sale. Okay, I want to charter a vessel. I've got these 5 vessels. What Martin's saying, I mean, then I need to screen those 5 vessels, but I also need to screen the counterparties, I need to screen the receivers, I need to screen all the different parties involved, make sure the bank's okay. And it's something that I don't think we can do as individuals. We need to have a lot more AI involved to handle it, but then we need to have experts who are overseeing the AI, who are actually the people who could step in and say, yeah, but this is actually wrong, and correct it.
Sure. Okay. So next question is to Julian. So Julian, I showed this before. And then I have a question from the crowd, which, wait a second, I can't read it anymore. Wait. Okay. So Sergio says, if indeed the portion of medium and high risk vessels for compliance, I think sanctions compliance, is just 6% of the market, why do the banks, traders, and regulators do not penalize the owners of these vessels in order to clear the industry and bring more sustainability? At the end of the day, this is just a question of price that allows the existence of shipping companies operating with such profile. What do you think, Julian?
I think the banks don't see it as their role to be the police force of the industry and the sector. You know, it's not, they informally police the sector and penalize by reducing trade and finance for those that don't comply, and those that fall foul and find themselves on the OFC or OFAC lists, they will cease to be able to trade. But I don't think you're ever going to see any one area moving into a role of being kind of a sanctions police authority by directly penalizing those vessels that regularly breach. And of course, what we've always seen in our markets is whenever there's a tension creates opportunity. So there's always going to be those people that will look for areas to operate, and there will be people that want to operate where sanctions or regulatory compliance restrict the market, because other players will say, okay, we're not going to deal with this anymore. We're not going to carry this kind of cargo. We're not going to trade to this jurisdiction. But somebody always will.
I think I have a good example for that. It was Venezuela trade. So I have a good friend, which is Greek, which told me that right after last year, when Pompeo came to Greece and sanctioned all these companies and all these vessels, and they said, we didn't know about it. So he told me, listen, Ami, I was in a dinner last night with these guys and last week, and they said, it's great money. It's worth the risk. So I guess it's just a business decision. Marty, what do you think about that? What's your perspective?
Well, I want to go back to your previous question, actually. And I think one of the reasons why you don't see clamping down on the owners is because many of these really bad vessels are owned by the same companies that own the good vessels. It's fairly typical that you'll have a company that owns between 50 to 100 vessels, and there'll be a handful of them that have Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Crimea issues, and sister vessel risk ever since PB Tankers and Costco is something that is, I think, on most people's radar as you can't just look at the vessel that you want. You got to look at the sister vessels, because those are the vessels that might get your group owner or your registered owner in trouble. And it's the same big owners. Every big owner, go ahead and look at their fleets on any system. You're going to see that they have a lot of good vessels, but they got that handful of bad vessels mucking everything up, right? And that's what I worry about. That's what keeps me up is I got a vessel, she's green on the windward system, but she's got 5 that are red. Are those 5 going to get all the other green ones in trouble? So it's way more complicated than that. If the big owners, maybe they need to create like a bad bank, like back in the day of that, where they just put all those bad vessels in another owner so that we can just avoid them. It would make my life a lot easier.
I really like that. Okay, so one last question I have, and we're going to wrap up. So Imad asks, and maybe Paul, you could help me with that, or Richard. Based on your view, the Core Energy Efficiency Design Index, EEDI, i.e., how a ship is built, and the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, i.e., SEEMP, with all of these regulations compliance, will there be more regulations to comply? What do you think, Richard? What do you think, Paul? Will there be more regulations?
There will be more. So I'll just step in quickly, Paul. I mean, I think there will be more regulations. They're going to have to be more regulations. The concern for me is that the regulations are going to come from the regulators, not come from the industry. And I think we need the regulations to come from the industry. And we saw that with the IMO 2020 regulations for capping the sulfur in fuel oil. It was a regulation that, because the industry wasn't able to get together and actually put in place measures themselves, we ended up with the regulations being put in place for them, and then everyone trying to run to catch up and figure out how to handle it, and saying, well, what kind of fuel are we going to be using? How are we going to manage this? Whereas I think that we'd be much better off if we actually managed to come together as an industry and almost self-regulate.
Okay, cool. Paul, closing, tell me a quick answer, and then I want closing notes from everybody.
Yeah, I do agree. I think that there will be more regulation because there is a need for criteria for availability in the industry. And just to bounce back on what you said on banks, right now we meet banks. I meet many banks, trade finance banks, that are already ready to propose preferential financing terms to sustainable trade. And they told us, now we offer preferential terms, but in 1 year from now we won't finance trades and industries that is not sustainable.
Okay, cool. So taking a step back, thank you, everybody. I just want one sentence from everybody to wrap up. Okay, we have ship owners, we have charterers, we have the container trading industry, and we have a trade finance industry. Everybody's looking at carbon accounting. AI can do that forward. False positives is bad. You probably want accuracy and actionability and decision support. Richard, closing notes from your end. One thing to take away.
I think we're facing an amazing opportunity, and I just hope that we seize that opportunity.
Okay, so it's not just a challenge and opportunity, Paul?
Yeah, opportunity, but risk that have to be mitigated with verification, with standardization and transparency.
Okay, Julian?
I talked about this thing about gaps in the shark net. Don't wait to get bitten by the shark. Get your shark net checked now.
Sounds good. Martin?
I think, Richard's right. The industry needs to get more involved in regulation, because otherwise you're going to have bank regulators regulating the shipping industry.
And for me, my closing note is policy is great, data's better, decision support is even better. So don't stay out there and just read news and read articles. Map your data, do something, join, data for decarbonization program, do something to move. If you're not leading, by definition, you'll stay behind. We're out of time. Thank you, everybody, for joining the panel. It's been great. Thanks, Ben, for joining us. Richard, Paul, Julian, Marty, thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend that's coming up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ami.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ami.
Cheers.